Fantasy romance is such a popular genre right now, and there's so many books coming out. There's so many authors that are writing in this genre. There are a lot of things that I love about this genre, but there are also some tropes or concepts that I don't see a lot of, and it might be because I haven't found them myself, or maybe they're just not as popular. I decided to write my own book because I wanted to bring my ideas to the table. I wanted to talk about the things I want to see more of in the fantasy romance genre as someone who is writing a book in that genre. I love when the female lead is strong in her own way. There's this really big push for these very like warrior type female leads, like fighters, and they're angsty and they're sassy, and I love those leads, and I think there's a spot for them in fantasy. But sometimes I miss that like whimsical, feminine, softer hearted lead who is like a princess who wants to look for love or wants to have an adventure or feels deeply or is a bit more shy or is a bit more sensitive or has dreams. And the thing about that lead is she is just as strong as the other type of lead. She's just different. Having that diversity and like showing how different leads can represent different types of people. She can become strong in many ways, but it doesn't have to sacrifice her femininity and her personality. Someone can be strong and powerful and have feminine qualities and love to wear dresses and love to dance and love to do her makeup and be very like soft and elegant. That more like fairy tale like fantasy where for example, like Rapunzel in Tangled, she is very soft and feminine and has a lot of those qualities, but she also is extremely strong where she can like stand up for herself and she takes agency in her life and she goes on adventures. A lot of my story is influenced by the story of Rapunzel. I've seen a lot of very mainstream fantasy romance novels have the female lead as like an assassin, a warrior, a thief, like a lot of these really cool things. But the female lead in my own story is a princess. She's an heir to a throne. She's going to be queen of a kingdom. We've gone away from like women only being princesses. And I think that's so important to have that diversity, but also having women as like queens and princesses and like part of the royal court. Like I think that's also a really cool concept. Okay, so the meet cute. This is when the main character meets their love interest for the first time. And usually it's a really like cute or funny or intense or like a kind of memorable moment. But actually, on the contrary, I actually really enjoy when the meet cute is more subtle, where the two characters meet for the first time, and whether it's just a quick passing or they're kind of strangers or they don't really have a really strong opinion of the other person in the first interaction. I like to see like where two people start and then where they end up. And I think sometimes when you have characters have that really instant spark or like the instant chemistry or the instant attraction, it makes their arc sometimes less interesting because they're already starting from such a place of like intensity, where sometimes I like where by the end they're so intensely in love, but in the beginning it's like a stranger passing or it's a random person that they don't really have an opinion of, or maybe they're just slightly annoyed, or maybe they're curious but they don't really know why. Having that attraction and chemistry grow throughout the story on a subtle basis. Sometimes the characters are like unexpected with how much they grow feelings for this other person. And I think that's also very realistic in real life too, where I feel like that kind of trope of like accidentally falling in love, like I think that's a really beautiful thing. I do actually see a lot of this, but I definitely want to just touch on it because I think it's so important. I love when characters help each other grow, when the romance arc is connected to each individual character arc in general, where they help challenge and juxtapose each other to grow together. And that's kind of part of their romance arc, where they'll kind of like reject each other in the beginning because they don't understand that side of themselves, or they can't see like the other perspective, or they're trying to go against like their own misbelief or their own flaw. As they grow feelings for each other, they're helping each other on their own arcs, like break down their walls and like figure out their own development. I just love deeply complex relationships and like how they form. I know enemies to lovers is such a big trope, and I do love a good enemies to lovers when it's done right. But I'm a big fan of forbidden love, especially in fantasy romance. There's something about it that is so beautiful, and it's so like tense and like filled with conflict and angst. It's so obvious that they're drawn to each other, but because of whether it's like an internal belief or an external factor or something about their identity that they can't act upon it, I really love seeing that progression of that story because you get to see them grow feelings for each other in an environment that forces them apart. In a fantasy world, you can get really creative with this, whether it's like a magical barrier or a political barrier or a societal barrier. It's like something about their world does not allow them to be together. And I think that that's really cool because then to see to what ends will they go to risk everything to be together. And I think that that's a really beautiful concept. So I know in storytelling, everything comes down to conflict and tension, and that is really important. But I really love when a love story is very like wholesome and like healthy and like it makes you believe in love. It's so beautiful, and it doesn't mean it's perfect. They have their flaws, they have their issues, they have their conflict, but it's not this like really like back and forth toxic dynamic. They have their issues, but it's never like to harm one another. Like they always are there for each other, and it just makes you believe in love. I love a good villain arc where a character starts off as a neutral or a good character, and then through their influences and the psychology of who they are, they kind of turn to the bad side. And I think a lot of people can relate to this where they love morally gray characters, and I really love morally gray characters. And I think sometimes not having like one obvious villain or like good people, bad people, I like when there's like a really fluid mix of like everyone's kind of like on this spectrum of like good and bad, and they kind of move back and forth because it's based on like their experiences, their motivations, like how what they know about the world, what they've grown up knowing. And I think a lot of fantasy books do this really well, and I'd love to see more of this even further. Sometimes there'll be like an evil king or an evil like entity or something. And sometimes I love when those like evil characters get their villain arc where you can see where they started in the beginning and they weren't necessarily that bad, and then they kind of go to the dark side. You can also do the same thing where someone has a positive arc where they start as like a villain and then they kind of have that positive arc. Seeing that fleshed out in stories is so interesting because I know this kind of like reminds me of A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, where Snow in the beginning, spoilers, but Snow in the beginning was, it's not even like spoilers, like obviously he's a villain. Snow in the beginning is like very like neutral slash good, where he definitely has like kind of like morally gray qualities, but he has good intentions, at least partly, or he has good moments, and you can see that like good in him, and then he gets pulled into the dark side the more he gets through the story. That's such a cool concept in storytelling, because then when you think about like the villains in like later books, it's like so intertwined. Having these arcs for villains kind of moves out of that caricature like concept. That kind of moves on to my next concept of, I like when characters are ambiguous when you first meet them. You first meet a character, it's not they're the attractive love interest, they're the villain, they're the bad guy, they're the funny person. It's like you meet someone and you're meeting it through the character's perspective, and you don't necessarily know like what to think about them yet. And I love that, because when I'm reading a book and someone is introduced and it's so obvious that the story is trying to tell me like who this character is, sometimes it's not as fun for me. Like I kind of like when you're reading a character and you don't know whether to like root for them or to not root for them, or to be like angry at them or not. And I think that's so fascinating, and it's such like a psychological like thrill. You meet someone and you're like, wait, is this the love interest? And you're like, wait, is this the villain? And it kind of like switches and morphs throughout the story. Now talking about magic systems for a sec, I love when a story has a really deep and complicated magic system that connects to the world and the plot. A lot of fantasy books will kind of adopt concepts from other books, which is natural because that's like how we read and write. And there's a lot of like fae and powers and elemental powers, similar patterns of magic. And when I read a book that has like a completely unique style of magic, I'm so intrigued. I like the magic to be like interwoven into the story. In fantasy romance, you kind of have that spectrum of like stuff that's like very fantasy, stuff that's very romance. And I really love that like in between. If anything, like a little bit more fantasy, because I love when you have this really big world and like this really big plot and the romance just like beautifully interweaves with like that. Like in a fantasy world, you get to explore complicated concepts in the real world in a fantasy world. And I really love when a fantasy book really dives deep into like the politics of their world or the propaganda or corruption. Society itself is really interwoven into the world because in a fantasy world, there's so much potential for that. It also helps set up the internal and external conflict of these characters. And my book especially has really big societal themes in it. Messed up propaganda and like erased history and secret societies, and like that stuff is so interesting to me. And just diving deep into that, I am someone that I love painting like a movie in my head when I'm reading. And I love when there's very vivid, detailed descriptions of these worlds, especially in a fantasy book where I sometimes have a hard time being pulled into a story. And some people prefer like not a lot of details and description. And I do. Like, I love when there's a lot of sensory details and like, tell me about this world. Tell me about how it's different. Like, pull me out of this reality that I'm in and let me enjoy this. A really good example of this is I actually read, where is it? This book is actually a great example of that. A Song to Drown Rivers. It was beautifully written. This book is set in ancient China and the imagery was so beautifully done. I genuinely felt like I was in ancient China. Not only does it set the tone and the mood, but it just like brings the story to life. I love a good ballroom scene. I love when there's a dance and they have to get all dressed up. I also really love when stories connect like mythology and history into their worlds. Culture and mythology kind of like woven into the inspiration. More on a dialogue level, and this might be like super tedious to me, but because I'm a writer, I notice these things. When the banter or the chemistry is less is more. Banter and chemistry, and it's really good. But it's almost too good for too long, where I really like when the buildup is so subtle. I really believe less is... Kitty! Buildup is too quick, or it's too intense, or it's not as believable. And sometimes, even on like a dialogue level or a description level, I like when it means more if there's less. I love when a romance feels earned. Even the small things and just like the body language or the way they say things or the dialogue. Like, I love when there's like little hints. If you found yourself agreeing with any of these points, we probably have a similar taste in fantasy romance stories, which is exciting because I am publishing my debut fantasy romance this year. And it's about to be sent off to a professional editor soon. I just want to start talking about it more and make it feel alive and really connect with potential readers that are actually going to really understand and get my story and love it. Thanks for watching and happy writing.